Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some of your questions, and we are starting with Martin on the Patreon, who asks, can you compare/contrast our House of Commons camera rules versus those in the UK? I regularly see online pictures of a near empty UK House of Commons. Wide shots don't seem to bother them. Why should they continue to bother Canadian MPs? So this arises from a discussion we've been having online about what's happening in the US House of Representatives and how the speaker election allowed for more cameras and more camera angles than they normally allow, and it's created a big sense of drama, given that something that normally takes 2 or 3 hours took a week to do. And how in Canada we have the same kinds of restrictions around limited camera angles, tight shots, very few wide shots, no reactions, that kind of thing. And what's interesting is that the UK's House of Commons is almost the complete opposite. And I did look into this, and it's so they started televising their House of Commons in 1989, which is far later than we did. We started in 1977. And initially, the UK also had rules around tight shots, very few wide shots, very few reactions. It did seem that they did allow them a little bit, but within weeks, it became such a big deal and the sense of drama and theater that they just decided to throw out those rules and go for wide shots, go for reactions. And it's created a much more enjoyable and dynamic viewing experience. And I think part of that has to do with both the substance of their debates, because they will actually have real debates there. You will have people who will be able to be interrupted and have questions being asked and so on during debates, which is unlike how our House of Commons does. We have a little more of that in the Senate in Canada, but not in the House of Commons. So they have a little more drama, a little more debate, and their Prime Minister's questions in particular are also much more dynamic. And because they've got an actual debating style and use of self-deprecating humor and all of these things, it makes for a more dynamic experience. And the UK is much more, I guess, into that than we see in Canada. So I think that's partially culturally why they are not so afraid of the wide shots and the reactions. This point about the empty house as well is something that one of the things you find in the Canadian House of Commons is that on days when there aren't a lot of people in there, or when it's outside of question period and it's just regular debate in the House, and there's so few people in the chamber because it's just barely above quorum generally, because MPs are otherwise off at committee or other meetings. What they tend to do is they crowd around the current speaker so that it looks full in a tight shot, and then play musical chairs on their side for whoever's speaking, so it looks like it's much more full, they're much more engaged, when they're really not. And I think that has to do with kind of the sense of artifice that we kind of have embodied in our own parliament. It's kind of a almost self-importance around it. They think that these speeches, and their speeches, it's not debate, are, wonderful, and they want to clip them for media or for their own social media. So they want to look like they're, have the august background, and there's all these attentive people around them, hanging on to every word they're saying, when they're really not. Most of the time, people on House duty are busy doing their own paperwork, or, on an iPad or something. So again, versus the UK, where I think I don't think there's the same level of artifice around what they see as debate in the chamber, because chamber debates in the UK are much more, they're A, they're debates, and B, it's they're there for a specific purpose. It doesn't go on for 3 or 4 days. It's for an afternoon. It's contained, but they also have an awareness that the other MPs are off at committees. They have other work that they're doing. The whole day doesn't revolve around what's happening in the chamber. And I think there's a much more awareness of that. And I think that's also why they're less afraid of it than we are in Canada. So that's kind of some of the differences there. And I wish we could have some of what the UK does in terms of both the substance of of debates as well as their not being afraid of, having dynamic camera shots during their own debates. Our next question is from Twitter, and it comes from Nighthawk, and it's on a related issue when she says, I believe it's she, I found out this week that some Canadians take question periods seriously. Should they really? I got the impression that they thought QP was the real day-to-day government of Canada stuff instead of political theater. So for this, should they take it seriously? Yes and no. Yes, it is theater, but it is also an accountability exercise. And one of the differences between Canada and the UK, for example, is in the UK, all the questions are known in advance. PMQs are only on Wednesday. The Prime Minister is only there on Wednesdays. All of the questions are known in advance so that they have time to prepare and brief. And you get a little more substance that way, where in Canada, because nobody knows the questions beforehand, it also allows it to be a little more dynamic and a little more reactive in terms of news of the day. So there is a little more in terms of stuff that's in the news cycle that can be asked. And it can be asked of any minister or the Prime Minister, whereas in the UK, they've got designated ministerial days, Prime Minister Wednesday. So it's much more structured in that regard. So that is kind of one of the advantages of Canada. The other flip side of that is that because they don't have enough really knowledge in advance, they're kind of prepping for anything. So things tend to be a little more shallow. In terms of, so that's in terms of taking it seriously. There is a perception that what happens in question period is what happens during the entire day, instead of 45 minutes of that day. And I think that has a lot to do with because media generally only clips from question period because, frankly, there's not much to clip from the rest of the day in the House chamber. Chamber debates, like we were saying, are just people reading speeches into the record. There's not a lot that's really interesting or dynamic or, frankly, of much value in that 19 times out of 20. So when all you see in the media is those dynamic question period clips, it's easy to get a perception that this is what happens during the entire day. It's really not. I kind of make the joke that the biggest danger MPs face for the rest of the day outside of question period is developing narcolepsy, because if you are unfortunate enough to have House duty and have to listen to hours of 20-minute prepared speeches one after another, you'd probably develop something like akin to narcolepsy before too long, which I think is the real danger. So I think that's kind of just why people have that perception, is just because that's what they see in terms of clips from media or social media. And question period has developed into really a place to get those clips. It was initially for TV clips. Now it's for social media clips. So that's where some of those perceptions are coming from. Again, do we take it seriously? Yes and no. Yes, it's theater, but yes, it is also an ability to have that accountability discussion as things are developing, as opposed to waiting for a designated day and ensuring that you have a minister who is properly briefed with questions beforehand. So a little bit of of either side there. Our last question is from Richard Martin, also on Twitter, who asks, is proportional representation possible in Canada given the regional skews in population/members, such as PEIs, for senators and MPs? Yes and no. most proposals tend to deal with mixed member proportional. So you have a certain number of MPs who are elected for seats and another who are elected in the party, which kind of represent just the party itself. What is constraining in Canada is the constitutional requirement that seats are apportioned by province. You can't really do top-up seats that cover nationally. They would have to kind of be assigned provincially, and that can create problems in terms of oversized ridings for the riding seats as opposed to the party seats. And we are already in a situation in this country where we have ridings that are literally larger than France, particularly in some of the northern and more remote ridings, to say nothing of the territories. So the ways around that, if we were to adopt a proportional representation system, could be either to start adding a whole lot more seats to balance things out a little more, which some people are very squeamish about because they don't want any more MPs. I personally think our parliament could use a whole lot more MPs, but that's a discussion for another day. Or the other way around that is to make have a constitutional amendment that will get around this apportioning of seats per province. That is probably easier to do in terms of constitutional amendments, because that should likely only be the kind of amendment or amending formula that would that Parliament could possibly do on its own. Although there is the possibility that certain provinces would challenge that in terms of feeling their representation might be in danger, so they might go to the Supreme Court and see if a different amending formula would be necessary, possibly the 750 formula, 7 provinces with 50% of the population. I can't imagine that would be a unanimous consent formula, amending formula, but anything is possible with this discussion. But those are the kinds of challenges around that. That you will get discussions around things like, well, why don't we do multi-member ridings, which again leads you to the problem of oversized ridings, particularly the rural and remote ones. People will say that the way to get around that is to have urban ridings be multi-member and remote ones not, but then you start getting into unequal voting systems, which I think the Supreme Court would probably have an issue with. So I guess I'll suffice to say it is possible, but it would require a certain amount of creativity and or changes to the Constitution if we don't want to simply add a whole lot more seats, which is a way around it, but not a lot of people would necessarily have the appetite to do that. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.